Hello and welcome to Year 12 Biology. Today's lesson is all about terrestrial ecosystems. Let's get started. So your syllabus objective today hasn't changed to the last one. We're still comparing different ecosystems across spatial and temporal scales. So last lesson we were talking about aquatic, this time we're talking about terrestrial, and we're going to have a look at the roles of the abiotic and biotic factors in those different spheres and how they compare. So let's start with it easy. What is a terrestrial ecosystem? It's all the living organisms that exist in a land-based habitat and their abiotic conditions. So that includes the biomes that we're familiar with, the rainforest, the taiga, which is that really cold one, the tundra, which is even colder, almost nothing can live there, certainly no trees or shrubs, the temperate forests, either deciduous or not. Living here in Australia, we don't tend to get very many deciduous forests. The grasslands and the desert, which we get a lot of. Classifying those terrestrial ecosystems is a bit like us giving you a bag full of lollies and asking you to sort them. Every individual person will sort them differently. You could sort them by colour, you could sort them by chocolate content, by brand. There's a whole different ways, and none of them is actually right or wrong. It just depends on the individual. So there are, just like that, classifying ecosystems, there's a couple of different ways to do that as well. So we sometimes classify them based on their biomes, which really is all about their latitudes, how cold they get, how far north or south they are from the equator. Sometimes we organize them into ecozones, which are enormous zones, all about how long different organisms have been evolving relatively isolated patterns within a particular zone, because they're either usually separated by a really big ocean. Those ecozones then get broken down into ecoregions based on geology, soil, climate, and the major plants that grow there. And of course, we've done Holdridge's life zones, which is another way of classifying them based on a whole bunch of those things. So this is what the ecozones look like. If we were to put them on a world map, you've got the Nearctic, Neotropical, Paleoarctic, Africotropics, Indo-Malay, and Australian, which of course includes our brothers New Zealand and everybody a bit further north. And it's really just about which species are isolated enough over a long enough period of time that their evolution sort of stays together and diverges from everybody else. As you can see, many of them are actually joined by a land bridge, so it's a little bit arbitrary. Ecoregions, so ecozones that get divided down into ecoregions. They're geographically distinct communities based on geology, soils, climate, and the vegetation that grows best there. So Australia, if we were to divide it up, you get a lot of the desert and xeric shrubland, an awful lot of it. A little bit of Mediterranean forests, woodland, scrub, and of course quite a lot of tropical and subtropical rainforest, going all the way down to us, where we've got little patches here on the Gold Coast, got little patches of subtropical rainforest, but mostly it's temperate. Sometimes we can actually divide it into vegetation zones instead of, or as well as, ecoregions, which just help us to determine the zones based on the relative amount of water. So around the edges of Australia, we get a lot of water, and as you move inland, you get less and less available water. So that does away with a lot of our rainforests. When you think about rainforests, we're really talking about the far northeast coast of Australia. But if you go up into Arnhem Land and Kakadu, it looks lush, but the amount of water there is actually lower. So under this categorization, it doesn't become a rainforest. It's a wet sclerophyll forest or a tropical woodland, which is why it's so hard to classify. Life on land is more variable than living in water. Because we've got a greater range of abiotic conditions, it gets hotter, it gets colder, we have a greater range of environments, which of course means more microclimates, which means more niches, more places and ways for animals to do their living, which means we get a greater biodiversity as well. This table is straight out of your textbook, and it talks about the factors affecting terrestrial communities. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. So some of the bad ones, let's start with the bad. we get really variable temperatures, which means animals and plants have to adapt to specific temperature ranges. And if they are carried by the wind or migrate out of that range, they're not likely to survive very well. That was a very big thunderclap in the middle of a storm here. The air is not particularly buoyant, which means if you are a jellyfish, you're not going to do well on land because you don't have the support structures that animals need for locomotion on land. And of course, in Australia, we understand this one very well, scarcity of water. Depending on where you are, you can have an abundance of water or you can have not enough. Favourable factors to living on land. You've got a plentiful oxygen supply. The air is transparent, so we can see it. You can see things coming for you. The air has low viscosity, which means we can be a bigger range of shapes. We can produce sound in a greater variety, and it's the reason we can talk to each other with such varied languages and pitch and pace and pause. And we also get that greater variety of habitats, which leads to greater niche formation and overall greater biodiversity. Stratification. We were talking about stratification in lakes last lesson, lakes and oceans. And you had all the different levels, and you had to remember the Bathel zone and the Hadal zone and all of those. Land-based systems also get stratification. Sometimes it's horizontal, particularly we'll go into that when we talk about succession, but mostly when we're talking about it, we're talking about plants and we're talking vertical zonation from the ground up. So forests all over the world show this pattern of layering. You've got the top layer where the fastest growing ones have popped up out the top of the canopy. Then you've got the main structure of the canopy where it's really dense and a lot of things are competing for sunlight. Then you've got the sub-canopy underneath where if you're a little slower growing or you're younger, you're going to have to fight your way through to get enough light. And it's usually determined by the dominant plant species in an area, how tall that canopy becomes. There are 5 layers in most forests. Some of them don't have all 5 layers, but a rainforest, we're going to use the rainforest as our example because it's so complex and you get all 5 layers. We start at the forest floor, is our first layer, and it's really dark down there because not much light is going to be able to penetrate down through all the other trees. The understory, the sub-canopy, the main canopy, and of course the emergent layer. So let's start at the top of the world. The emergent layer is the furthest one from the ground. It's where the fastest growing of the trees has popped out the top of the main canopy. So up there at the top of the world, they get full sunlight beaming down on them all day, which results in really high temperatures, strong winds, but very, very low humidity. So plants that live at this altitude need to be adapted to those conditions. The next one down is the canopy layer. That is the thickest layer of tree crowns. It stops a lot of the light from passing through. Now that 98% depends on the type of forest that you're talking about. That one is a Amazonian rainforest, but it stops a lot of the wavelengths of light heading down through the canopy and into the lower layers. Some of the light is reflected off leaves and branches, but a lot of it is absorbed and used for photosynthesis. It means that organisms living in this canopy are exposed to high light intensity, high temperatures, strong winds because there's nothing really to protect them, and very low humidity. The sub-canopy layer, depending on the thickness of the canopy above, can get very dark very quickly. It's very much sheltered by the canopy above it. We tend to say that it has medium light intensity, wind, humidity, and temperatures. When we get to the understory, sometimes known as the shrub layer, we have low light intensity, low temperature, high humidity. A lot of the time when we're walking through this zone, it's a cool place to be, cool place to hang out on a hot summer's day, quite humid. The air feels still and heavy, but often as you're walking through there, it's dark, and the light that does reach down through there is majoritively green wavelengths. So it's got this cool green atmosphere to it. But this does pose some challenges for photosynthetic organisms that want to live in this understory layer. they need to be very efficient photosynthesizers, or they need to use non-traditional photosynthetic pigments. So you'll find that organisms that live down here are adapted to have higher levels of chlorophyll A and B in order to efficiently photosynthesize, or they've adapted things like lycopenes and carotenoids, which are different colored pigments which absorb different wavelengths of light. But of course, no plant can absorb every wavelength of light, so there's always going to be some light all the way down to the forest floor. The forest floor layer has relatively low growth of plants because it's the limiting factor down there is the light. There's a relatively low levels of usable light wavelengths that plants can use to do photosynthesis at this level. Places like the Amazon forest, that's why you find that there are carnivorous plants down at the forest floor. They've had to evolve other methods of getting their food, getting energy. Very low light intensity is the limiting factor. Very low wind and very high humidity. You often find that down here you've got a really deep leaf litter, which provides surfaces for lots of organisms to live in. You'll often find that this leaf litter is a repository or a seed bank for all the seeds that have been dropped from above, and they'll wait there dormant until an opportunity presents itself. So, for instance, lightning might strike a tree up in the canopy and it falls, leaving a gap in the canopy above. So sunlight will trickle down, hit the forest floor, and it will trigger a lot of those seeds to germinate and start growing. And they'll keep growing and growing all the way up to that canopy until they fill up the gap in the canopy again. So it is light that drives stratification in forests. It's that stratification that also increases biodiversity, which is the number of different species living in the area, because it reduces competition. As the trees grow taller, they filter out the sunlight, creating that gradient of abiotic factors. Very low humidity at the top to very high humidity at the bottom. Very high light at the top to very low light at the bottom. That then causes the formation of different microclimates. Different microclimates means different niches. If you can't remember what a niche is, it's the way that an organism can live, breathe, eat, inhabit a specific zone. More niches means greater biodiversity because there's less competition. You can't have two dominant species without competition, but if you have niches where one prefers a whole lot of light and the other one thrives at lower light levels, they're no longer in competition. Both of them can thrive in their relative niche. Well, that's all we have for you today on terrestrial ecosystems. I hope that you put together a Venn diagram for yourself now that you've done aquatic and terrestrial, and start having a look at the things they have in common, things that they have separate. So a Venn diagram is a great way to start listing your understanding. Thank you very much. I'll see you next lesson.